50 years of protection, what about the next 50? When I got asked to do this, I did wonder whether everybody would think this would be some sort of scientific view of all the different techniques that we would be using over the next 50 years. Unfortunately, it's me, so that's not going to be the case. What I'm going to run through really is a little bit of where we've been, a little bit of what the problems are and perhaps how we solve them and how much that's going to cost us a way forward. So not a lot of science, but a lot of discussion. And it's my personal view based on my own experience with the input of a few others. So feel free to argue with me. Just to refer back on what do we have? Well, the UK's maritime cultural heritage is internationally significant. It's immensely popular with the public. We've got more heritage sites within the UK waters and more historic ships and aircraft wrecks globally than any other nation. The sites within the UK waters include ships and aircraft belonging to a multitude of nations, and it's a past shared and celebrated by many other nations alongside of it. And by its very nature, it's an international activity. It crosses national boundaries, it involves different nationalities, and it links different people. So really, it's all of the things that heritage should hit. In choosing the illustrations on the side there, I did find it quite hard to celebrate Britain's maritime heritage without pictures of people killing with each other. But at least we've got Cook. And at the bottom there, we've got the bell of the USS Jacob Jones, the first American warship lost in the First World War that's off the Scillies. So as an idea of the contribution in international significance. In the beginning, with the Protection of Wrecks Act, very early on, other people have been through this really, but as a means of beginning to acknowledge the significance of shipwrecks and their contribution, it was a key part of that. I've chosen the Mary there as the first site designated outside of England, being on the Skerries and Anglesey. But it's also important to remember, I think, that it didn't begin with the Protection of Wrecks Act. Jones of Black Taylor and Honor Frost were in at the very beginnings of maritime archaeology at Cape Caledonia 10 years before that. So we've got a very long history of dealing with these things in the UK. Things that have made a significant difference, particularly in the early years, Colin Martin's work on the Spanish Armada really opened up how archaeology to make a contribution to what had before that been seen to be a largely historical event, and did change the picture of that. Keith Muckleroy's work with the Bronze Age, which has continued well into the 21st century through people like Southwest Maritime Archaeology Group, opened up the first connection with the Mediterranean in the UK, the first movement of metals on a ship in Northern Europe, amongst other things. So these sites have made a significant difference to what has happened. There's Mare Rose, which we all know about, that scaled up all of these techniques and made a huge difference to things. And other things that are perhaps less well known, things like the Holland 1, the salvage of the first Royal Navy submarine, which developed knowledge of these submarines, but also made a number of significant mistakes and lessons that came from that. And I think that's part of developing anything. You've got to accept the fact that you are going to do things new, you are going to make mistakes, and you are going to learn from them. And if you've been to the Submarine Museum now, you can see, despite a fairly tortuous journey through everything, that shipwreck has made a contribution to our understanding of the history of submarines, and the museum exhibits of these things. And sort of early years of the 70s and 80s were followed by years of less activity, the late 80s and the 90s, when probably the most famous site was the Stirling Castle, also seen as the years of active neglect when no money was being spent on anything, and sites like the Stirling Castle could decay away in front of our eyes. In fact, it was thought then that the best place for British underwater cultural heritage was being wrecked in other waters. And as a case of that, the Pandora, wrecked on the Great Barrier Reef at the end of the 18th century, excavated by the Museum of Queensland between 96 and 99, a site where British archaeologists went out to gain experience and to see how things could be done well, because they weren't being done well back here in the UK. And altered really with the National Heritage Bill in 2002 and the involvement of what was then English Heritage and later Historic England, which really was a time of great hope, I suppose. The involvement of Heritage Agency, the involvement in England, the involvement of additional funding, additional expertise, a chance to shape a future for it. But not remembering, of course, that actually both Scotland and Wales had led first with things like the Dewar Point wreck and the Newport ship, who were doing things in the late 90s. I think the cavalryman at the head there looks a bit like Ian Oxley, who I think is to be congratulated for the efforts that he put into turning what was then quite a random collection of individuals and people into a sort of coherent force for good. So, and there was seen to be a fear that these changes wouldn't result in another Stirling Castle, that when something else turned up that was eroding away, there would be an attempt made to save it. And there were several of those done through through Historic England. The one that I'm personally connected with the most is the Swatch Channel wreck, where Historic England, amongst other people, funded the rescue excavation of that site, in direct contrast to what had happened with the Stirling Castle. And not to forget others, there were things like Kevin's work on the Colossus, Wessex's work in the Thames Estuary, and work on the Mary Rose at the same time. So it was a step change from what had been going on 10 years before. At the same time, we had the development of both diving techniques and archaeological standards that upped the game for everybody in terms of what should be done. You know, the change from sites being disposed of through auction houses to material going into museums, having standards to follow for excavation and recording, and also the increase in regulation of diving over that period, where we went from being a discipline that was exempt from the diving regulations to one that was judged in the same way as diving in the North Sea was, all of which is a good thing. Of course, the issue with diving is increased regulation and safety, all of which is a good thing, has vastly increased the cost of doing this work. And I don't think today, for example, we could even do what we did on the Invincible just a few years ago. It would be done under much stricter health and safety activities, which is a game changer because that's a vast increase in cost. So at the end of all that, what do we have over this period that was good? Well, we got a policy that within territorial waters, 12 nautical miles, is probably adequate and workable and a lot better than a lot of other people have got. We got a legal framework that is the same, really. We've got management where Underwater Heritage is responsible of the UK heritage agencies. We've got extensive professional methodology and guidance. And we've got a skills base, which I think now is very good compared to what it was 20 years ago. And that skills base involves avocational licensees, professionals, Brits, international people, all of which has been really brought together in England, at least with Historic England funding. And we've got an education system that really is brilliant, and we see that quite frequently in terms of putting things out to the public through social media, and also through museum displays, if you think of what's happened with Invincible. But I'm also not sure that we're setting an agenda with this. We tend to be celebrating the positive sides of it, but we're not pointing out what the problems are and perhaps what the way forward from that is. So where is it perhaps not so good? Well, outside of 12 nautical miles, as a country, we haven't got a single coherent policy on underwater cultural heritage. The responsibility is split between various departments, agencies, and public bodies. The heritage agencies don't have the ability to protect things outside of 12 miles. In some, it varies in quality. In some areas, it's quite good. In other areas, it's non-existent. This should really be led by the Department of Culture, Media and Sport. who've got responsibility for heritage located in this area, but don't even engage with stakeholders anymore and have failed really to provide any leadership for it. And we have environmental policy that envisages a continued expansion of offshore seabed development, which is going to continue to expose new underwater cultural heritage sites with no real policy in place to manage them. So there is no strategy out there and no real leadership from government. We do know of at least 5 wrecks that would be protected as protected wrecks if they were within 12 nautical miles. The oldest of these is mid-17th century and the youngest is 1744. 3 of them have been subject to looting. Indeed, the oldest twice, as the first discoverer sold the position to another salvager that then looted the second time. On one site where the government has attempted to manage the site by giving it to a charity, it's been subject to industrial scale disturbance. There's only very legal limited means to protect sites out in this area with no government funding to manage them. And what work occurs, I apologise for the dog in the background, what work occurs is exceptionally expensive and to date has been managed by charities and individuals who've raised the fund to fill in for the government in action in these areas. In terms of development, I think we're potentially a world leader in the archaeology of development of these areas, but we don't yet seem to have accepted the fact that merely discovering wrecks is a risk beyond being immediately mitigated by developments. Internationally, we've got a lot of famous warships and other vessels in international waters. You know, as I put here, missing war graves and national embarrassment. We've got the example of things like the Queen Mary in the North Sea, sunk at the Battle of Jutland, which was looted in 2016 with sufficient evidence to demonstrate which ship it was and who stole the objects from it, but this was insufficient to result in a prosecution. An HMS Exeter in the Java Sea, discovered in 2006, completely disappeared by 2017 as a result of salvage. Went from being a complete shipwreck to a hole in the seabed. And very recently, HMS Prince of Wales, lost in 1941, salvaged this year over a period of several months. It was being monitored at the time, although nobody appears to have been looking at the data. And it's only afterwards when the Maritime Observatory went through the records of this, they detected the presence of a salvage vessel on site, which is there with the resultant oil slick, as well as material being loaded in, being landed in Malaysia. I'm just looking at stopping at the news agents a couple of days ago. It's interesting to see in the press, people often get very excited about the desperation of war dead, but they don't seem to be pushing for anything to be done about it at sea. And of course, these things continue to turn up. In the last couple of years, we've had the discovery of Durance in Antarctica, and this year, the announcement of the discovery of Thistle, a British T-class submarine lost off Norway, found as part of a marine biological survey. And several British ships turn up internationally each year. So it's not something that's going to go away, it's going to increase. If you want to manage shipwrecks properly, you need to have an infrastructure with which to do it. You need to have the ability to handle equipment, to process it, to store it, to conserve it, and eventually to curate it. It's something we've had on multiple occasions in the past, through all of the projects there, when these things have been put together at great cost, resources and experience amassed to do the work, and at the end of the project, the funding stops and it disappears, which in itself is a great cost, and a few years later, that's to happen again. In terms of long-term curation of material, you know, after you've conserved it, how you store it depends on what happens to it, either destruction or curation. And very few, in fact, almost no museums have the capacity to do this now. And I'm aware that they're increasingly wary about taking maritime archaeological material. And in fact, some are actively trying to get rid of maritime archaeological material because of the costs involved in it. It's possible to build stores to store this stuff adequately, and the Newport ship have done that for the material from their side in Newport, an internal store. And in the past, in ripping off the Newport ship's idea, we've built a couple of shipping containers for various projects where material can be stored safely and environmentally controlled atmosphere. But it's not really a long-term solution, temporary stores like that. You need something much more permanent. And looking around in the UK, we have several permanent stores for different sorts of material. They've got a huge conservation centre for tanks in Bovington. We've got a fantastic store for naval aviation, the Fleet Air Arm Museum. And Historic England, English Heritage even, has several regional environmentally controlled archaeological stores where archaeological material is stored. And this is the kind of thing that you need to store maritime archaeological material in. And it's not something that would cost huge amounts of money in the overall scheme of things. And it's not something that would cost huge amounts of money to run. But if there was one central store for that kind of stuff, then you would actually make a huge difference. In terms of what is out there, well, we know that aerial photography in the early 20th century gave us a much better picture of archaeology in the UK. Trying to achieve the same at sea, which is just from wreck sites. So in the Irish Sea and the sort of chaos of all the shipwrecks there, a lot of which are unknown or where they are dead or have been misidentified. But if you took a structured view to that and just looked at them individually, as has been done in the Irish Sea through Innes McCartney's project, where he's working with Manchester University and bathymetric survey of sites, has managed to confirm the identity by connecting the survey data with the archaeological record or the bathymetry of it, where he's identified, in this case, the Messina here, which the site which originally was thought to be the city of Glasgow. So by comparison of bathymetry with historic records, and that's something that could be done across the whole of the UK. And looking at things as collections, we have a huge amount of shipwrecks, as we've said earlier, some of which are more important or less important than others. If you just took the Navy, the Commonwealth Navy, a period that spans 111 years, you've got 16 wrecks, a number of whom, well, a lot of whom were at sea with each other at the same time. So in terms of investigation or preservation or management, we really should be considering what these are telling us and what we need to do about it, and do we need to keep everything from them. If you look at a period I'm a little bit more familiar with, the Georgian Navy, the work on Invincible has been so extensive and produced so much material. I think you'd have to question what you would do elsewhere that isn't going to add to that picture, really, or what is particular about other vessels that offer a different version. Perhaps it's a period, perhaps it's a material type, perhaps it's a different ship type. We've got 6 third rates from the Stuart navies. Are they all going to tell us the same thing, or are they different? And certainly, thinking of what's going on at the moment, really, the jewel in that crown now is the London, wherever that is on there, which is probably the most extensively preserved. But all the others have a story to tell. It's a matter of working out what it is. And in situ protection, we can preserve things underwater, but it's not cost-free. There's the rudder carving head off the Swash that we managed to preserve for 7 years underwater, whereas other objects fairly close to us eroded away because we couldn't protect those. So you've got to make choices, really. If you are going to preserve things underwater, it's not cost-free. It has to involve intervention of some sort. and some things you can't preserve in that environment. So what don't we have? Well, outside 12 miles, we've got pretty inadequate policy. Management, lots of departments involved, often very poorly coordinated and applied. The skills base, as I said, we've got an extensive skills base. In my experience working with other people around the world, we're as good as anybody else, really. But those skills take a long time to gain and they fade fairly rapidly, which is going on at the moment. There is a loss of skilled people outside of maritime archaeology at the moment because there isn't the work to keep them there. Infrastructure, we have some. You need it if you're going to engage in maritime archaeology, but it's sparse and it's vulnerable and it could easily disappear. Museums see maritime archaeological material as problematic because resources to curate it is largely lacking, and funding. Whichever way you look at it, everything costs money. If you save money in one place, it's got to cost in another, and there are no cheap options. The cost has got to lie somewhere. And you can, if you involve yourself in a very large project, you could be spending £18,000 a day, which is a lot of money. So really, money is everything. Maritime archaeology's major problem is money or the lack of it, which is the root of all evil. We're all very aware of austerity and what's happened there. The days when heritage agencies could step in and do things like the Swash Channel Wreck appear to have disappeared. They now see them, well, they're now funded to the point where they can regulate and they can help identify problems, but they're not in a position to find long-term solutions to them. And they're looking really for private individuals and charitable organisations to look for sources of funding to manage things with. Unfortunately, I can't see largely where those funds are. So it's difficult to see as in the long term how that would work with anything except mass loss of material. And I was interested in what Terry said about what Historic England spend on maritime archaeology, which I, as you pointed out, is a substantial percentage of their budget. But I think it may only be 80% of what DCMS was spending before the National Heritage Act, although that is a very back of a fag packet calculation. So we seem to have gone backwards in 20 years. So what do we need? You can't hope for things to get better. You've got to attempt to strive for them, really. So we need to develop policy and legislation to cover the UK marine area, the ability to survey sites anywhere in the world and to any depth, the ability to conduct major management archaeological interventions, provide public education via museums and social media to curate maritime archaeology in suitable conditions, to monitor important wreck sites remotely, which we can do anywhere in the world, the ability to maintain this capacity at a substantial level. There's no point developing it to then watch it fade, to then try and rebuild it 5 years later. And how much would all that cost? Well, not cheap. That's what I reckon, having priced that to do all of those things, to deal with all of the current asterisk sites and then come down to sort of monitor them, dealing with sites as they came up. You're looking at an average of 4.2 million a year, which might sound like a lot of money, but is it? The budget's that of a small business, which is defined as a business with a turnover of under 10 million. At least that gives you an idea of what it would cost to do all the work that should be done. How's that split? You can see it there. Really interestingly, of that money, this is the Swash Channel Wreck budget, only about 30% stays in archaeology. The rest of it goes out to deal with all the other skills and equipment that is needed. So it is a way of pumping money into coastal communities because all of this stuff is occurring around the place that you're doing the project in. It also shows that if you had a purely volunteer workforce, you're only saving 30% of the money because all the rest of this still has to be paid for. So who pays for it? Well, really, it's a choice for society. In the UK, we talk about it a lot. I'm not sure we actually value it because we're not willing to spend the funds on it. The UK performs poorly in comparison to other European nations in terms of protection and management. And that's because as a percentage of GDP, we spend, I won't read out all the noughts, there's the figure there. The European average is much higher, in fact, 1,712% more. If that was spent in the UK, that would be about 10 million. And you could argue that the Netherlands may have spent more on underwater cultural heritage in UK territorial waters than the British government has in recent years. So we are really behind the curve in terms of what lots of other countries spend on maritime archaeology. They tend to use that as well as dealing with stuff in their own waters. They use it as a soft power and influence through shared links. But in the UK, we're constantly having to fight embarrassing events engaged in underwater cultural heritage where wrecks are stolen, and this costs many thousands of hours of civil servant time. And you can see down there the budgets we're talking of less than 1% of Crown Estate annual income, over less than that percentage of unrecovered COVID debt. And there was an out-of-court settlement to do with underwater cultural heritage in the British government when they had to pay 15 million in compensation. Well, our annual budget's only 28% of that, the proposed annual budget there. So what do we do about it? Well, I took a lead from the NAS, who mentioned the Crooked House, which they say is in the Midlands, but it's actually in the Black Country, where a pub burned down over the summer, and the local residents have kicked up a hell of a stink. They've got themselves media coverage in America. They got Penny Mordaunt down there to view the site. That's made a significant difference in the area by connecting with politicians and getting them involved, because they demonstrated that they cared about this part of their cultural heritage that had been taken from them. If you compare that to the recent case where one of the Valentine tanks in Poole Bay has been damaged, where there was virtually no outcry and no political involvement. So I think as archaeologists, we need to learn the ability to campaign and argue about what we care for upwards in order to try and make our world a better place. Just finally, a few people whose ideas are incorporated in here. So that's me done with about 3 minutes to go, I think.
Very impressed with the timekeeping, Dave.
Yes.
Thank you very much. That's it. Turn on your camera. Brilliant. I mean, I really, when we were looking at putting together a 50th celebration of the Protection of Wrecks Act and the work that people have done and the successes, we really did want to balance it out with this honest appraisal of the situation. And it's not all rosy, and there are some amazing things that have been done over the years, absolutely phenomenal. And the level of support that has been achieved by many projects from organizations, both centrally from government and externally, has been fabulous. But I saw you give this presentation, sort of the early form of this presentation at an event in Plymouth a couple of years ago.
Yes, yeah.
And you've developed this further, because you've been delving into the numbers, I can see, in more detail than you had then.
Yes.
So in terms of this 1,702% less, or European countries spending that much more, how do you come to that figure? Because that's an amazing figure.
It is. It's based on, I mean, there's very limited information around, but you can estimate from activity in places like France and the Netherlands and Ireland, which are the countries where this kind of information is available for. So it is a back of a fag packet calculation, because the data is sparse and things are funded differently. But it shows the scale difference, really. I mean, it may only be 800% difference, or it might be 2,400% difference. It's difficult to equate them across, but it does show the scale difference. I mean, the figures I was talking about, they're an average of 4 million a year. That's only half of what our equivalent would be if we were funded as well as an example. So just,
is it worth a bit of research, but I'm not saying you, but a bit of work being undertaken to delve deeper into this comparison in order to demonstrate to ministers, in order to demonstrate to
I think it would be.
Yeah.
It could be done. It takes somebody time and trouble to do it, but it would be an interesting platform to make an argument against it. Is that if other people can do it and feed their nurses and have schools that aren't falling down, then we can do it as well. We still are a rich country. We're a large country. We've got a significant maritime past on which a lot of the country's wealth is based and is still based, but we don't value it as well as others do. I think that's That's the core of my argument there.
A question from one of our audience. Based on UNCLOS, the law of the sea, a country can protect cultural heritage in a zone of 24 nautical miles. Why does the UK only have 12 nautical miles?
You'd have to ask Mr. Williams that. I think.
That's a question to the lawyers.
Yes, a question for the lawyers. We don't.
Yeah.
I don't know why.
Yeah.
I'm not aware.
And then we also have a member with their lawyer's hat on saying that the problem with protection beyond 12 nautical miles is that the UK government can only legislate to affect UK citizens, companies, and those operating from. This is all in the chat, so people can read it. It clearly demonstrates the complexity. It's not a priority, obviously, with governments at the moment.
Yes,
not a political priority.
I don't understand the law, but other countries, the Dutch, the Americans, the Australians, make much more of a noise about things that happen outside of their waters and have less trouble.
And again, it's not a comment, but Alison says that the French DRASM model is one that I think has huge merit and that we should be looking at for a possible way of forward for the next 50 years.
Yeah, I would agree.
Okay, Dave, that's been brilliant. We've run out of time, I'm afraid. We're actually eating into Lauren's time, so I'm going to have to stop you there and kick you out of being a panelist and back to an attendee to enjoy the rest of the day. Thank you so much for stepping in and taking on the challenge. It's great that you could start off day 2 for us. Thank you, Dave.